The moment Keanu Reeves witnessed the flight attendant's cruel smirk toward the disabled veteran struggling to store his prosthetic leg case, something changed in his eyes. The packed flight from Los Angeles to New York fell silent as the attendant's mocking words carried through the cabin. No one moved. No one spoke. Just uncomfortable glances and lowered heads. Except for Keanu. What happened next would not only transform one veteran's life forever but would reveal a side of the Hollywood actor that no camera had ever captured. The quiet kindness that followed became more powerful than any movie scene, but the greatest surprise was still to come. Keanu Reeves never enjoyed the spotlight that came with his acting career. Even at the height of his fame, he preferred to blend into the background, to experience life as just another person passing through. His travel routine reflected this desire for normalcy. No first-class seats, no special treatment, no entourage clearing his path. He simply wanted to exist in the same world as everyone else. On this particular Wednesday morning at LAX, Keanu sat quietly in the boarding area of Gate 27, baseball cap pulled low, worn jeans and a simple black t-shirt making him nearly invisible among the crowd of travelers. He observed the scene around him with quiet interest. Families anxiously corralling children, business people tapping urgently at laptops, couples leaning into each other against the background noise of departure announcements. Then he noticed him. A man in his early 40s, military haircut still visible despite the silver strands beginning to appear, struggling slightly to maneuver through the crowded terminal. Henry Wilson moved with the deliberate caution of someone relearning how to navigate the world. His right pant leg was pinned neatly below the knee, and he carried a specialized case alongside his regular luggage, the unmistakable shape that held his prosthetic leg. The gate agent called for pre-boarding, and Henry approached, presenting his military ID and boarding pass. Keanu watched as the agent nodded respectfully, but behind Henry, he noticed the flight attendant standing near the jet bridge entrance. Something in her expression, a slight rolling of the eyes, a tightening of the lips, suggested impatience rather than compassion. As Henry made his way down the jet bridge, moving carefully but deliberately, Keanu felt a strange heaviness in his chest. Years of observing people had made him sensitive to the small tells of human behavior, the microscopic expressions that revealed true character. The flight attendant's subtle reaction troubled him, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. He gathered his single carry-on bag as his boarding group was called, unaware that what awaited on the plane would shake him to his core. Keanu settled into his aisle seat in the main cabin, placing his bag in the overhead compartment with practiced ease. 3 rows ahead, he could see Henry struggling slightly with his belongings. The specialized case containing his prosthetic wouldn't fit under the seat, and he was attempting to lift it into the overhead bin while balancing on his remaining leg. The same flight attendant Keanu had noticed earlier approached Henry. Her name tag read Veronica, and she wore the crisp uniform of the airline with perfect precision. But her face betrayed something her uniform couldn't disguise: impatience bordering on contempt. "Sir, we need to keep things moving," Veronica said, her voice carrying through the cabin. "You're holding up the entire boarding process." Henry looked up, a flash of embarrassment crossing his features before he composed himself. "I'm sorry. Just need another moment to secure my prosthetic case." Veronica sighed dramatically, making sure everyone nearby could hear her exasperation. "This is why we offer assistance for passengers with special needs." She emphasized the last words with a tone that transformed them from an offer of help into something approaching mockery. The cabin grew quieter as passengers became aware of the interaction. Henry continued his efforts, dignity intact despite the growing flush of humiliation on his face. "Perhaps next time you should check that," Veronica continued, gesturing toward the prosthetic case. "Or arrive earlier if you need extra time. Other passengers have schedules to keep." A woman seated near Henry half rose, seemingly about to offer assistance, but something in the veteran's expression, a silent plea for the chance to maintain his independence, made her settle back down. "Sorry for the inconvenience," Henry said quietly, finally managing to secure his case in the bin. As he lowered himself into his seat, Veronica wasn't finished. "Honestly," she muttered, loud enough for several rows to hear, "military discount tickets are hardly worth the hassle." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older gentleman in business attire looked up sharply at the flight attendant, disapproval evident in his expression. But no one spoke. From his position several rows back, Keanu felt a sudden tightness in his chest, a sensation he rarely experienced, genuine anger rising like a tide. He watched as Veronica moved on, her practiced airline smile returning as she assisted other passengers, as if the moment of cruelty had never happened. Henry sat motionless in his seat, eyes forward, his face a careful mask that Keanu recognized all too well. The expression of someone who had learned to endure humiliation rather than challenge it, who had faced so many battles that sometimes surrendering to small injustices was simply the path of least resistance. The boarding process continued around them. Announcements about departure times and safety procedures filled the cabin. Life moved on, as it always did, flowing around moments of quiet suffering like water around a stone. But Keanu couldn't look away. There was something about the veteran's stillness, the dignified way he absorbed the blow without retaliation, that spoke of a strength few people possessed. And there was something about the casual cruelty of the flight attendant. Not an outburst of anger but a deliberate decision to diminish another human being, that felt impossible to ignore. As the final passengers found their seats and the cabin doors were secured, Keanu made a decision. He wouldn't be a silent witness. Not this time. Some injustices demanded response, even from those who preferred to remain in the background. As the plane began to taxi, he unfastened his seatbelt, knowing exactly what he needed to do. The plane was still taxiing toward the runway when Keanu unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up in one fluid motion, ignoring the startled glances from passengers around him. A different flight attendant moved toward him with concern, but Keanu gave her a reassuring nod and moved up the aisle with determined strides. Veronica was near the front of the cabin, checking seat belts when she noticed Keanu approaching. Her expression shifted instantly from professional detachment to recognition, then confusion. Whatever she had expected from this routine flight, a confrontation with Keanu Reeves wasn't part of it. "Sir, you need to return to your seat until we're at cruising altitude," Veronica said, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to passenger compliance. Keanu stopped directly in front of her, his tall frame giving him a presence that commanded attention without aggression. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried to nearby rows. "I'm going to need to speak with your supervisor when we land," he said, his tone lacking any Hollywood drama but filled with a quiet intensity more powerful than shouting could ever be. "What I just witnessed isn't just unprofessional. It was deliberately cruel." Veronica's face flushed, her eyes darting to the veteran and back to Keanu. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Keanu replied, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "That man risked his life serving this country, and you mocked his disability in front of an entire plane. Everyone heard it. Everyone saw it." By now, the plane had come to a stop on the taxiway, the engines idling. The pilot's voice came over the intercom explaining a short delay in their departure sequence. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for this unplanned confrontation. "I'm requesting to be seated next to him for the duration of this flight," Keanu continued, gesturing toward Henry. "And when we land, I'll be filing a formal complaint." The cabin remained silent. No passenger interrupted. Even those who hadn't witnessed the original incident could feel the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. Veronica's professional mask cracked slightly, uncertainty replacing her earlier confidence. "I'll see what I can arrange," she said finally. Keanu gave a single nod, then turned and walked directly to Henry's row. The passenger in the seat next to the veteran was already gathering his belongings, seemingly understanding the situation without words needing to be exchanged. Keanu sat down beside Henry, who had watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of surprise and something approaching wonder. "You didn't have to do that," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying the weathered tone of a man accustomed to fighting his own battles. Keanu turned to him, the anger in his eyes softening to something warmer. "Yes," he replied simply. "I did." As the plane resumed its position in the takeoff queue, something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin. A wrong had been confronted, not with shouting or threats, but with the simple powerful act of refusing to be a silent witness to someone else's pain. The plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin settled into the rhythm of a cross-country flight. Beside Keanu, Henry sat quietly, his gaze directed out the small window at the vast expanse of clouds below. Neither man had spoken since takeoff, both seemingly content with a comfortable silence that sometimes exists between strangers who have shared an important moment. It was Henry who finally broke the silence, turning slightly in his seat. "Most people would have just watched," he said, his voice carrying no accusation, merely an observation. "That's what usually happens." Keanu considered this for a moment. Maybe that's part of the problem, he replied, his voice thoughtful. We've all gotten too comfortable watching things happen. A flight attendant, not Veronica, approached with the beverage cart. She served them both with extra attentiveness, her smile genuine when she made eye contact with Henry. Word had clearly spread among the crew about what had transpired. After she moved on, Henry shifted slightly, adjusting his position to accommodate his missing limb. Afghanistan, 2014, he said, answering the unasked question. IED on a routine patrol outside Kandahar. Took my right leg below the knee and two of my buddies entirely. Keanu nodded, absorbing the information with quiet respect. I'm sorry. Been 9 years now, Henry continued, his voice matter-of-fact rather than seeking sympathy. The physical part gets easier. It's the other stuff that lingers. The other stuff? Keanu asked. The way people look at you. Or don't look at you. Henry gestured vaguely toward the front of the plane where Veronica was now serving first-class passengers. Some people see the missing leg and think they know your whole story. Others see it and immediately look away, like my injury might be contagious. Keanu listened intently, recognizing in Henry's words something he had observed throughout his life. How quickly people form judgments based on surfaces, how rarely they looked deeper. What do you do now? Keanu asked, genuinely interested. Trying to figure that out, actually, Henry admitted. Was a sergeant in the army. Led a team. Had purpose. He paused, the weight of the transition evident in his words. Civilian life is different. Working with a veterans program in Boston. Counseling guys coming back with invisible wounds. The ones inside your head that don't get Purple Hearts. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. Sounds important. It is, Henry confirmed. But funding's always tight. Veterans programs are everyone's favorite cause during election years and first on the chopping block after the votes are counted. There was no bitterness in his tone, just the resigned observation of someone who had seen the pattern repeat. As their conversation continued, passengers in nearby rows occasionally glanced over, some recognizing Keanu, others simply drawn to the intensity of the exchange. A child from a few rows ahead wandered down the aisle and stopped beside them, staring openly at Henry's pinned pant leg. Before either man could speak, the child's mother appeared, mortified. Tommy, that's not polite, she whispered, trying to pull him away. Henry smiled gently at the boy. It's okay. You have a question. The child nodded. Does it hurt? Sometimes, Henry answered honestly. But I'm tougher now than I was before. The boy seemed to consider this deeply before nodding with the solemn acceptance that children sometimes show for difficult truths. His mother mouthed a thank you as she guided him back to their seats. Kids are easier, Henry said after they'd gone. They just ask what they want to know. It's adults who make it complicated. Keanu smiled, seeing in this veteran not a victim but a man of remarkable strength. As their conversation unfolded over the next hour, Henry shared more about his life. His struggles with the VA system, the challenges of finding employment with his disability, the support group he led for other veterans dealing with PTSD and reintegration issues. What began as a simple act of standing up against an injustice was transforming into something deeper. A genuine connection between two men from vastly different worlds, finding common ground in their shared humanity. Though neither could have predicted it as the plane continued eastward, this chance encounter would soon grow into something that would change not just Henry's life, but the lives of countless veterans facing similar battles. The plane touched down at JFK International Airport shortly after 4 p.m., the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the tarmac. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, Keanu remained seated beside Henry, waiting patiently as the veteran prepared for the complicated process of navigating the narrow aisle with his disability. I can get the case for you, Keanu offered, gesturing toward the overhead compartment where Henry's prosthetic was stored. Henry nodded gratefully. Thanks. Usually I'd insist on doing it myself, but after a long flight, the phantom pain kicks in something fierce. Keanu retrieved both their bags and the specialized case, noticing how Henry winced slightly as he stood, adjusting his weight on his remaining leg. The hours of sitting had clearly taken a toll on his body in ways most passengers would never understand. As they made their way toward the front of the plane, Veronica stood near the exit, her professional smile firmly in place as she thanked departing passengers. When she saw Keanu and Henry approaching, her expression faltered slightly, uncertainty and something approaching shame flickering across her features. Keanu paused at the exit, Henry beside him. "I'll need the name of your supervisor and the customer service office location," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Veronica handed him a business card without comment, her eyes downcast, avoiding contact with either man. The confrontation Keanu had promised earlier didn't materialize. It wasn't needed. His actions had already spoken volumes. In the terminal, as they walked toward baggage claim, Henry turned to Keanu. "You don't have to follow through with that complaint, you know. You've already done more than most would." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about punishment. It's about change. If nobody says anything, nothing improves." He paused, then added, "Where are you staying in New York?" "Veterans Affairs has a housing facility in Queens," Henry replied. "Nothing fancy, but it's close to the rehabilitation center where I'm scheduled for evaluation tomorrow." Keanu nodded, processing this information. "Do you have transportation arranged?" Henry shrugged. "The VA shuttle should be waiting. Might be a while though. They're chronically understaffed and overbooked." They reached the baggage claim area, the carousel already spinning with luggage from their flight. Around them, other passengers hurried toward exits or connecting flights, the momentary community of the airplane already dissolving back into individual journeys. "Let me give you a ride," Keanu offered. "My driver's waiting, and I'd like to continue our conversation." Henry hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "You've done enough already. I'd consider it a favor," Keanu pressed gently. "I'm interested in hearing more about that program you mentioned." Something in Keanu's sincerity seemed to break through Henry's hesitation. He nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. Outside the terminal, Keanu's driver waited with a black SUV, nothing flashy but quietly elegant. The driver, recognizing the situation immediately, assisted with loading Henry's bags without making him feel like he needed help, a small courtesy that didn't go unnoticed. As they drove through the congested New York traffic toward Queens, Keanu made several quiet phone calls, speaking in low tones that Henry couldn't quite overhear. Between calls, their conversation continued, building on connections established during the flight. When they finally arrived at the VA housing facility, the contrast with the sleek Manhattan skyline they had just left behind was jarring. The building was functional at best, a converted office building with minimal accommodations, showing signs of neglect and underfunding. Henry explained that he would be staying here for 3 weeks while undergoing evaluations and fittings for a new prosthetic. Keanu walked with Henry to the check-in desk, observing everything with quiet attention. The peeling paint in the hallways, the flickering fluorescent lights, the overworked staff trying their best with limited resources. Behind the desk, a harried administrator was attempting to manage a backlog of arriving veterans, many with visible injuries similar to Henry's. "This is typical," Henry said, noticing Keanu's expression. "The system's broken, but it's all many of us have." Keanu remained silent, but something in his eyes had changed. The same quiet intensity that had appeared on the plane when he confronted Veronica. It wasn't just anger. It was resolve. After Henry had checked in and received his room assignment, Keanu helped him carry his bags to the small, Spartan room that would be his home for the next 3 weeks. The space contained little more than a bed, a dresser, and a small desk, with a shared bathroom down the hall. "Thank you," Henry said as they prepared to part ways, extending his hand. "Not just for today, but for understanding. Most people see the leg and think that's the hardest part. It's not." Keanu shook his hand firmly. "I'd like to stay in touch, if that's all right with you. I think there might be something important we could do together." As Keanu left the facility, he made one more phone call. This one longer and more detailed than the others. Whatever he had witnessed had set something in motion, something that would extend far beyond a single act of standing up to injustice on an airplane. In the 3 days following his encounter with Henry, Keanu canceled his scheduled meetings in New York. The film discussions and publicity appearances that had brought him to the city suddenly seemed trivial compared to what he had witnessed. Instead, he immersed himself in research, making calls from his hotel suite to contacts throughout his network, not Hollywood producers or directors, but people who could offer real help. Philanthropists, veterans advocates, medical specialists, and friends with connections to support organizations. On the 4th morning, Keanu returned to the VA facility in Queens. He found Henry in the physical therapy room, working with determination on exercises designed to strengthen his remaining leg. Sweat beaded on the veteran's forehead as he pushed through obvious pain, his face set with the same quiet dignity Keanu had observed on the plane. "Mind if I join you?" Keanu asked, setting down his leather messenger bag on a nearby chair. Henry looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Didn't expect to see you again," he admitted, taking a towel to wipe his face. "Figured you'd be back to Hollywood by now." Keanu shook his head. "I've been thinking about our conversation. About what you said regarding the programs for veterans and the challenges you all face." He pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten notes. "I'd like to understand more, if you're willing to share." Over the next several hours, Henry introduced Keanu to other veterans at the facility. Each had their own story, different wars, different injuries, different struggles, but common threads emerged: bureaucratic obstacles to receiving proper care, employment challenges despite valuable skills, isolation upon returning to civilian life, and the particular difficulty of navigating a world not designed for those with disabilities. Keanu listened intently, asking questions that revealed his growing understanding of the systemic issues at play. He took notes continuously, occasionally making quiet phone calls when specific needs or problems were mentioned. What began as a fact-finding mission evolved into something deeper, genuine connections forming with the men and women who had sacrificed so much. As evening approached, Keanu asked Henry to join him for dinner at a small restaurant near the facility. Over a simple meal, he finally revealed what he had been working on. "I've established a foundation," Keanu explained, his voice matter-of-fact rather than seeking recognition. "It's being structured specifically to address the gaps in the current support system for veterans." He outlined his vision, a comprehensive approach that would include housing assistance, employment opportunities, advanced prosthetic technology, mental health services, and advocacy for policy changes. Henry listened with growing amazement. "This is substantial," he said finally. "Most people who get fired up about veterans' issues lose interest after a few days. Their outrage doesn't last." Keanu's expression remained steady. "This isn't about outrage. It's about responsibility. About seeing something wrong and having the means to help fix it." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were details of a position: Director of Veteran Outreach for the newly established foundation. The salary was substantial. The responsibilities aligned perfectly with Henry's experience in counseling returning veterans. "I need someone who understands this from the inside," Keanu explained. "Someone who can speak with authenticity about what veterans actually need, not what others think they need." Henry stared at the document, his expression unreadable. "Why me? You barely know me." Keanu considered the question carefully. "Because you didn't ask for help on that plane," he said finally. "You were enduring something painful with dignity, not seeking attention or sympathy. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Over the following weeks, Keanu's plan expanded beyond helping just one veteran. Using his connections and resources, he arranged for the renovation of an entire floor of the VA facility, transforming it from institutional austerity to a space designed with healing in mind. State-of-the-art equipment replaced outdated machines in the physical therapy room. The dreary cafeteria was redesigned to feel more like a community gathering space than a hospital canteen. For Veronica, the flight attendant whose actions had triggered this chain of events, Keanu took a different approach. Rather than pursuing punitive measures, he arranged for her to participate in sensitivity training programs developed by veterans themselves. The airline, eager to avoid negative publicity, embraced the initiative and began implementing it system-wide for all customer-facing staff. What had begun as a single moment of standing up against injustice was transforming into something far more significant: a structured, sustainable effort to address the broader issues facing veterans returning to civilian life. And at the center of it all was the unlikely partnership between a Hollywood actor who shunned the spotlight and a disabled veteran who had never sought recognition for his sacrifice. As summer turned to fall, the Foundation's work expanded across the country, with similar initiatives taking root in VA facilities in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Dallas. What Keanu had set in motion was no longer just about one veteran or one moment of cruelty. It had become a movement. Winter settled over New York City, 6 months after that fateful flight. The foundation that had begun with a single moment of moral clarity had grown into something remarkable. Officially named the Second Chance Veterans Initiative, its headquarters occupied a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn, with satellite offices emerging in 5 other cities across the country. Henry Wilson had transformed as well. The hesitant, withdrawn veteran Keanu had met on the plane was now a confident leader, overseeing a staff of 20, all veterans themselves, who coordinated everything from housing assistance to job placement services. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by purpose, his military background once again becoming an asset rather than a burden in civilian life. On a snowy December morning, Henry led Keanu through the Foundation's newest project, a residential facility designed specifically for disabled veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Unlike the sterile institutional setting of the VA housing, this building featured accessible apartments with dignity and independence built into every design choice. Wide doorways, adaptive technologies, and communal spaces created an environment where veterans could heal while building a supportive community. "We're already at capacity with a waiting list of 47 veterans," Henry explained as they toured the building. "Each resident gets individualized support, medical care, job training, psychological services, all coordinated under one roof." Keanu nodded, taking in the details with quiet satisfaction. He had provided the initial funding, but the foundation had quickly attracted other donors, corporations eager to support a well-run organization with measurable results rather than empty promises. The airline industry had undergone its own transformation. The training program initially designed for Veronica had expanded into a comprehensive industry standard, with major carriers implementing protocols specifically addressing the needs of disabled passengers, particularly veterans. Veronica herself had become an unexpected advocate, channeling her shame into substantive change. She now led training sessions, using her own mistake as a teaching moment for others. In the residential facility's common room, several veterans gathered for their weekly support meeting. Some had visible injuries like Henry, others battled the invisible wounds of PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. They welcomed Keanu not as a celebrity but as a fellow advocate, someone who had earned their respect through consistent action rather than hollow words. One young woman, a former army medic who had lost both legs in Syria, approached Keanu after the meeting. "Before this program, I was living in my car," she said simply. "The VA waitlists were months long, and my family couldn't handle my PTSD. Now I'm starting nursing school next semester." She didn't offer effusive thanks, that wasn't the military way, but the steady look in her eyes conveyed everything words couldn't. By the Foundation's 6-month mark, they had provided direct services to over 300 veterans nationwide. More importantly, they had created a model that other organizations were beginning to replicate, a holistic approach that recognized the complex challenges veterans faced rather than offering piecemeal solutions. What had begun with a moment of cruelty witnessed on an airplane had transformed into a movement of compassion and practical support. The incident itself was largely forgotten. Keanu had ensured no publicity surrounded the Foundation's origins, but its impact continued to ripple outward, changing lives in ways that statistics could never fully capture. For Keanu, who had always valued privacy and authenticity over public recognition, this was the most meaningful project of his life. Not because it carried his name, it didn't, but because it represented the simplest and most powerful truth he believed in, that witnessing suffering creates a responsibility to act, and that actions, not words, reveal our true character. 1 year after their chance encounter, Keanu and Henry stood together at the opening ceremony of the Foundation's newest facility in Boston. Snow fell gently around them as they cut the ribbon on what would become the flagship center for veteran rehabilitation and reintegration. Unlike traditional ceremonies, there were no press releases, no cameras from major networks, just the veterans themselves and the people who had worked tirelessly to create this space of healing and hope. In the crowd stood Veronica, now the head of accessibility training for her airline. Her journey from that moment of cruelty to becoming an advocate had been its own form of redemption. She caught Keanu's eye across the gathering and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of how a single interaction had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. After the ceremony, Keanu and Henry walked through the quiet halls of the new building. The walls displayed artwork created by veterans in the Foundation's therapy programs, expressions of pain, hope, struggle, and resilience that spoke more powerfully than any mission statement could. "I never asked you," Henry said as they paused before a particularly moving painting of a military funeral. "Why did you really do it? That day on the plane, you could have just looked away like everyone else." Keanu was silent for a moment, considering the question with a thoughtfulness that characterized everything he did. "I think we all have moments where we see something wrong and have to decide, do we act or do we witness? That day, I just couldn't be a witness anymore." As they continued their tour, veterans approached to share stories of transformation, not just of new prosthetics or accessible housing, but of regained dignity and purpose. What had begun with a single act of standing up against injustice had created ripples that continued to expand, touching lives across the country. When they finally reached the building's entrance again, the snow had stopped, leaving the world covered in a pristine blanket of white. Keanu glanced at Henry, standing tall on his new prosthetic, confidence radiating from him as he greeted each veteran by name. In that moment, Keanu understood the most profound truth of all, that seeing the invisible struggles of others isn't just about witnessing their pain, it's about recognizing their unlimited potential when given the chance to reclaim their dignity.